ਸਤਿ ਸ਼੍ਰੀ ਅਕਾਲ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਰੇਡੀਓ USA ਸੁਣ ਦੇਖ ਰਹੇ ਸਾਰੇ ਹੀ ਸਰੋਤਿਆਂ ਦਰਸ਼ਕਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਜੀ ਆਇਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਆਖਦੇ ਹਾਂ। ਅਪਡੇਟ ਫਾਰਮਿੰਗ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਹਾਜ਼ਰ ਹੋ ਚੁੱਕੇ ਹਾਂ। ਮੈਂ ਰਾਜਕਨਵੀਰ ਸਿੰਘ, ਮੇਰੇ ਨਾਲ ਇਸ ਟਾਈਮ ਸਟੂਡੀਓ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜੁੜ ਚੁੱਕੇ ਨੇ UCANR ਮਡੇਰਾ ਤੇ ਮਰਸੈਟ ਕਾਉਂਟੀ ਤੋਂ ਫੀਬੀ ਗਾਰਡਨ। Hello Phoebe, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So what are we going to be talking about today?
Well, I thought we could talk about a couple of things. We could probably start off with talking about nitrogen management in almonds, since this month is kind of an important time to start cutting back on nitrogen.
Okay. So let's start talking about it. First, let's tell maybe the persons who doesn't know about it, why is nitrogen important and why do we need to cut it now?
Well, nitrogen, of course, is really important for plant growth. Bearing trees need a lot of it, about 68 pounds per 1,000 pounds of kernel yield. It's important for a lot of processes like proteins, amino acids, just plant function in general. But there is a disease called hull rot of almonds where the almond hull will become infected. There's a couple of different kinds of fungal pathogens that will cause it.
Okay.
But what will happen is that they all inject some sort of a toxin into the plant and it will kill fruiting wood. So for really severe infections, you can actually have reduced yield next year or even the years afterwards.
Okay. So does this disease affect like a certain age tree or any age tree?
I would say it could affect any tree that's bearing.
Okay.
It's connected to over-application of nitrogen as well as really heavy irrigation. It's known as the good grower's disease.
Okay.
So there are certain cultivars that are really sensitive to it. So nonpareil, very commonly planted, it's pretty sensitive to hull rot.
Okay.
So now is a really important time because if you have, high tissue levels of nitrogen and maybe you are applying a lot in the spring,
Okay.
you want to cut off nitrogen now so that the nitrogen can start decreasing in plant tissues as that fruit's developing, and that will reduce the chance that you'll get hull rot when hull split happens.
So do we have to lay off the nitrogen slowly or at once?
You can just cut it off. So by this time, about 75% of the nitrogen that the trees need has already been taken up.
Okay.
So most of that kernel development's already done.
Okay.
There's still some stuff going on, but for the most part, the plant has what it needs. And there's probably some nitrogen left in the soil too. So they have what they need, and so you can just cut it off.
All right. So how to, there is no other way to be safe from that disease other than cutting off nitrogen?
There are a couple other things you can do. Another big one is to stress the trees out a little bit at hull split. So for about the first 2 weeks after hull split, particularly with sensitive plants, or I should say cultivars like nonpareil, you can cut back the water. You don't necessarily have to cut it by much. About 10% of what you normally would apply might work. But the best way to manage this is with a pressure bomb, or collecting stem water potential, because you're actually asking the trees how stressed they are.
Okay.
So we say 14 to 16 bars is probably pretty good. For, nonpareil typically has hull split around the 4th of July. And so that can really significantly reduce the amount of damage you see to hull rot as well.
Do any of the farmers need to test the nitrogen levels or they just need to cut it off?
I mean, you can, but part of the problem is that our standards are developed for July. So, it's a little too late for that information.
Okay.
Yeah, you can do what's called an early leaf sampling protocol where you sample about a month after bloom, which is March, April, maybe early April. It will we have a protocol that will help you predict what your July leaf tissue levels are.
Got it.
So it can tell you if you might be really high or might be really low. You can also kind of base it off of yield. Maybe if you guessed or thought that you're going to be bearing way more than you actually are, and you've been targeting those early applications to meet a crop need that really isn't there, that could be a good indication too that your trees are going to have too much nitrogen.
Too much nitrogen.
Yeah.
So it's just vegetative growth otherwise if we keep on giving nitrogen?
Yeah, it's a little complicated, but yeah, you can get excessive vegetative growth as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, hull split rot, and is there any other disease need to look for during this time?
Um, Off the top of my head, no.
Mm-hmm.
There are definitely some early season diseases. You might have like anthracnose, shot hole. Those tend to be connected to early spring rains, but they also kind of tend to pop up after harvest.
So this Hora disease, so the hull split rot, does this happen only in almonds, or other crop trees also get affected by this kind of excessive nitrogen thing?
Holra itself is only almonds. I think in general, it's known that excessive nitrogen can make plants more susceptible to diseases.
Got it.
But the specific disease itself is unique to almonds. I'm a like nutrition person, not a pathologist, so
Got it.
those fungal pathogens might cause diseases in other plants. But
So it's always better to lay off nitrogen by end or by mid or end of June.
yeah, there's a new approach I think in fertilizing almonds where instead of doing like our traditional applications where you apply once a month starting in March, April, and May, you do what's called spoon feeding where you take the amount that you want to give to the plants and you give just a tiny amount on a weekly basis or sometimes even twice a week.
Okay.
And we think that whole rot might be connected to spring nitrogen levels rather than like your fertilization rates.
Okay.
So if you're spoon feeding and you would be applying all throughout that kernel development, you might have a lower chance of getting whole rot. I've heard talking to some growers who are trying it that it's successful, but I don't think that we have University of California or Fresno State research supporting this yet.
There's not enough data for you to
No,
support that.
but I'm just in case you want to play around with it.
Yeah, so it's better to give it a little bit a weekly rather than giving it all together.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, instead of just giving one giant shot, you're just applying a little bit of it at a time.
And gives more chance for the tree to absorb it too.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, you might, maybe accidentally over irrigate, and so maybe you push that nitrogen out.
It just leaches out.
Yeah, but if you're applying just a tiny bit at a time, that's less likely to happen.
So, talking about irrigation to water management. So, what's the scenario with the almonds right now? So, keep on irrigating till what time before you put them in stress?
Until the first 2 weeks of whole split. So we
Okay.
have about a month for some of our early splitting cultivars like Independence and Nonpareil. Something like Monterey might be 2 months or 3 months. So just keep an eye on the trees. If you have an irrigation system where you can irrigate your cultivars separately, that's great because you don't have to stress the nonpareil or the Monterey's while you're trying to reduce
Okay.
whole rot in your nonpareils.
So, it's right around hull split when you need to lay off irrigation. Do we still need to keep a little bit going, or how much?
I would
Are there any
say
standards for that?
you probably want to just increase the length of time between, and it's best to just monitor the trees with a pressure bomb so that you are hitting that level of stress and then you turn on the water again.
Okay.
So you're just stressing them out just a little bit.
So that pressure bomb, that's a new thing for me. I might not have done it. Maybe a lot of the other listeners have, who are not with the agriculture. So how does this thing do? Do they do it on their own? Do we have to hire somebody to do it?
You can do it on your own. So I guess the formal name for it is a pressure chamber, and you're measuring what's called stem water potential on plants.
Okay.
So that's a measurement of water stress. So basically, water in plants is under tension. Plants are trying to hold on to water, but the atmosphere is pulling out
Pulling it
water.
out. Okay.
And so it's a measure of how strong the pull is from the atmosphere as well as how well watered the plants are. So basically, we have what's called a baseline, which is the stem water potential at a certain temperature and humidity that a well-watered almond tree should be at. So what you're doing is you're seeing if you're maintaining your trees at that baseline or below. And so you can buy a pump-up pressure chamber where you have this little chamber that you pressurize well, you put a leaf in it first, you pressurize it, and then when the pressure in the chamber is equal to the tension in the leaf, again, that's how strong water is being sucked out of that leaf, water will actually start bubbling out from that petiole. So a pump-up chamber, I believe, costs about $1,500. You can get bigger ones that have like a tank that you would fill up with compressed air or nitrogen that can run a couple $1,000s, and some companies will do it for you as well. So maybe if you have enough employees and a couple of orchards, you can do a pump up, and it's a useful tool anyways for irrigation because it'll tell you if the trees actually need water. And
how often do we need to do this if somebody really have it?
I would say it depends on what you want to do with it. So if you want to use it to manage your irrigation, you can just go in before you're going to start turning on the water and see what the stem water potential is.
Oh, okay.
If it's about 2, maybe 4 bars below the baseline, that can indicate that the trees need some water.
Okay.
But maybe if they're not quite to that point, you can wait. But then, of course, if you're doing whole rot, you want to try to get to that 14 to 16 bars before you start turning on the water again. If you just want to do a whole rot measurement, you might be able to just make a contract out with a company that can just come in and do it for you.
How many samples in an orchard do we need to take, or just a couple of trees?
I think just a couple of trees per irrigation block is fine. You want to pick trees that that aren't too small or too big, that kind of on average. Spread them out. If you have a sandy streak, you can measure that. The trees are probably going to be more stressed on a sandy streak, just because it's going to hold less water.
Hold water.
Yeah. But I would say maybe 6 to 8 trees.
Okay.
And then you can make a decision based off of that.
And is this I would say water management thing applicable to just almonds or other crops as well?
It's applicable to walnuts and grapes.
Okay.
You can take stem water potential in pistachios. We aren't entirely sure how well pistachio stem water potential responds to irrigation. I have seen in a trial where I was definitely applying, stressing out pistachio trees with not applying enough water. Well, I should say
by how many bars?
Well, I'm not. So I had an irrigation trial where I had 100% ET, 50% of ET, how much water those plants are losing, and 150%. I wasn't really seeing anything like.
Really?
Yeah, no differences.
All 3 of them same?
For the most part, yeah. When I ran the statistics, like once or twice, I might have seen significant differences. And I have a couple of colleagues, too, that haven't really seen pistachios respond. And so at this point in time, I think that maybe soil moisture sensor is a better
option.
Yeah, for pistachios. We might find out more information, but it's we don't have as much information on pistachio water use and physiology as we do in almonds and walnuts. So I have a couple of colleagues who are looking into this, and so maybe we'll find out more, but
not right now.
Yeah.
So for almond orchards right now, I was in the orchard recently with Dr. Riyad, Fresno State University, and we saw there was a lot of mummies in there. One of the young orchards, maybe they hadn't harvested it. And there were a lot of navel orange worm larvae and pupa, which is going to be flying out soon. So what kind of things you want farmers to know about it or do about it?
Well, so at this point in time, you probably just need to wait until whole split happens and you start to see egg laying happens. And then you can apply an insecticide spray for that. Unfortunately, mummy sanitation, that should have happened definitely before bloom.
Yeah.
And then mating disruption is best started in March. So at this point in time, it's just watch and wait and be ready to spray. And I know almond prices are really low. I'm not the one who's signing the checks and paying everybody.
I know.
But sanitation is really important for controlling navel orangeworm. And with this new Carpophilus truncatus beetle we found last year, Currently, sanitation is the only tool that we have that we know works against this pest.
Is this the same guy as Australian fly?
I don't know if it's an Australian fly. So it's been found in Australia. I think it's been found in Europe as well.
Okay.
We don't know if it came here, as far as I know, if it came here from Australia or somewhere else. But yeah, they've been dealing with it there for about 10 years. They've tried insecticides.
Not working.
It just doesn't seem to work because I'm not the entomologist. I haven't done the research into it, but from what I understand, it's just harder for those insecticides to get to these beetles.
Oh, okay.
So the only thing that they know works for sure is sanitizing. And it's not just knocking those mummies out of the tree. So for navel orangeworm, we know that if you at least get those mummies out of the tree and get them onto the ground, the mortality for those larvae that are overwintering is greater. So you're going to have less moths emerging next year. But for destroying this beetle, you have to actually go through and destroy those nuts.
You have to mow it?
You mow it or flail it.
Oh,
I think
okay.
they've even looked at burying nuts with these Carpophilus beetles in them in the ground, and they'll just come out. So you have to
really?
actually destroy the nuts.
Destroy them.
Yeah.
Oh, fire? Burn it?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to pull them all out and set them on fire.
It's hard being a farmer, and
It
you have
is.
to keep doing something new. Something else is coming on
You
all
do,
the time.
and the financials are not good right now.
Yeah,
and
it's just expensive.
It is, and sanitation is really expensive. But unfortunately, it's just that's the only tool we have for Carpophilus right now.
And for pistachios, if we talk about it, what kind of bugs are we seeing in there too?
Well, I've been seeing a lot of what are called plant bug damage to pistachios. So those are they're leaf-footed plant bugs as well as stink bugs. They have similar kinds of damage where they have what are called piercing, sucking mouth parts. So they pierce the fruit and they suck out the juices. In pistachios, they both kind of show up around the same time in April, and they can cause damage to the nuts. And I've been seeing, I don't know if it's from leaf-footed plant bugs or stink bugs, because I've just been seeing the damage. But I have been seeing quite a few orchards with damage this spring.
So what's the solution for it?
These guys are hard to control. Partly it's because you can sometimes see the damage after the insects have already left. The only insecticides that work against them are broad spectrum. Even if you have the adults in your orchard, for leaf-footed plant bug in general, they're very mobile, and so they can fly away before you even see them. So we don't really have very good treatment guidelines for them, unfortunately. We say if you see damage and you see egg masses or juveniles or even adults in your orchard, that can be a good indication to spray. But we don't really have, what we call really good economic thresholds, which is, you see certain, like this many stings per 100 fruit or that sort of thing. It's just, I think for a lot of folks, it's their comfort levels and whether they see damage.
How much damage usually they do if somebody...
It can be really variable. There are some orchards that never have damage. There are some orchards that get hit every year. I think... So I was talking to our entomology specialist about this yesterday because I got, yet another question about it. They feed on weeds basically in the early part of the season, and then they move into orchards as those weeds typically dry up, which has kind of been happening, in May. And because we've had, some pretty two wet winters in a row, that's a lot of forage for these insects. Last winter wasn't that cold, so we might just have more overwintering populations. But yeah, the best management tools we have is in April in your pistachio orchards, March in almonds. Start going out, looking for damage, look for adults early in the season, egg masses and, earlier stage insects that can't fly later in the season.
That's the time to spray?
Yes. Well, I would say it's up to you because, again, we don't have good economic thresholds. But if you have a whole bunch of bugs in your orchard, yeah, you should probably spray.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's easier to look for the damage than it is for the actual insects.
Insect.
Yeah, so in pistachios, very early, around bloom and nut set, it'll just look like small blackened shriveled nuts.
Okay.
What I've been seeing is this damage is happening during the hull and shell expansion pistachios.
So that's basically you seeing it suck out the juices from it. That's why they shrivel and get black.
Yeah, and then as the nuts start to get a little bit bigger, you'll probably see just like a little bit of a gumdrop, and then the hull and shell itself will be blackened and kind of, maybe kind of curl up a little bit like this. When the damage happens starting now-ish, when shell hardening happens, you might actually not see a very good external sign on the hull and shell, and so you'll have to start cutting nuts open and looking for damage to the nuts, which will be, browning or staining the kernels themselves.
Okay. So anything else to take care about pistachios during this time? You mentioned before for the water management, it usually doesn't respond that well to it's basically the same.
For stem water potential, yeah. I mean, we have evapotranspiration, we have soil moisture sensors. So, this year, we've had another pretty good water year.
Yeah.
In drought years, the shell hardening stage, which is nowish, is a time when you might be able to start cutting back on water a little bit just to save. Post-harvest is another time of the year to do that, but I didn't double check the numbers before we came in here, but you could cut back on the water.
And how about nitrogen in pistachios?
Yeah, so nitrogen, you want to basically apply during after bloom, during the hull and shell expansion, as well as kernel development. So kernel development hasn't quite started. Hulls and shells have mostly fully expanded. The shell's starting to harden. And so the kernel development, which is mid to end of June through harvest, is when trees demand most of their nitrogen and especially potassium. Like 90% of the potassium that pistachios take up is during that kernel development period. So it's important, just like with almonds, to split your applications up all throughout that period. And I guess luckily we don't have any issues that are associated with over-fertilization of nitrogen in pistachios, aside from, leaching out nitrate into groundwater and that sort of thing. But in potassium in particular, it's good to make sure you're ready and on top of those applications to make sure the trees have what they need when they need.
With all the economic things and as you were also mentioning, the prices are pretty low or bad, however you want to say. Aren't farmers already cutting back on everything?
I think so. And so I think for almonds, I guess I'll say is we at UC, we're kind of struggling with, just like growers are, with, what's the most important thing to put your money into and where can you safely cut back? So for plant nutrition, anything that you might apply as just in case it's going to make the trees grow better, that's probably an easy place to save some money on. Making sure you're checking your leaf nitrogen levels and taking advantage of that early leaf sampling protocol. If you have 140-acre block, a leaf sample for 140-acre block is probably going to be about $70 for the test. And so it can be a really good way, especially for an expensive nutrient like potassium, to know if you're on track. So if you can safely cut back, you can. Trees do have a store of nutrients that they can rely on for a while, but it does take time to replenish those trees if they get deficient.
And it affects the next year.
Yep, it can. So if your trees are sufficient in nitrogen, potassium, you might be able to under-fertilize a little bit. Maybe don't cut it off entirely. But you are going to have to play catch-up in the future. So just keep that in mind as you're trying to make those decisions.
Any foliar sprays going on right now, or any time for any schedule for it? Any kind of sprays? Foliar
sprays for micronutrients are probably best during the spring, during that leaf expansion period.
Okay.
As that leaf hardens up and that waxy layer on the surface, the cuticle hardens, absorption of those micronutrients is actually a lot less.
Okay.
So it's best to do that during the spring. You could do other nutrients at this time of the year. I think that it's probably going to be most cost effective just to run it through the irrigation system if possible, especially for something like nitrogen, potassium. It's so much cheaper.
So much cheaper in that way.
Yeah.
And before hull split, you only put that spray insecticide if you see those eggs.
That's our guidelines. If you know that a flight is happening, you're seeing egg laying, and the fruit is vulnerable. So until hull split happens in almonds, the insects, navel orangeworm, can't get in. In pistachios, you can have early splits in July, and those early splits are actually really closely correlated to aflatoxin contamination. So it's good to go in July and start monitoring for early splits in pistachios, and it's really self-explanatory. You'll see just like a little tiny nut that's split. And so if you know that egg laying is happening, that could be a good opportunity to spray in that crop as well.
Does navel orange worm also affect pistachio?
Oh yes, yeah.
It affects everything.
It's less of an important pest in walnuts, but it's the most important insect pest in almonds and pistachios.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So it's about time. We need to move more on sanitation. Then.
In the wintertime, and sanitation is really important for pistachios as well. It's not quite as effective because those nuts are just a little harder to destroy, but it's good to do in pistachios as well.
How much pressure you saw last year of this navel orange worm, and what do you expect this year?
I don't do navel orangeworm research, so I couldn't tell you.
Okay.
It was very, very bad last year. I think because a lot of folks didn't sanitize because
it was just wet.
It was wet. It was hard for them to get in. I think some folks were looking at that as a way to save money because sanitation is really expensive.
Yeah.
So it was a very bad year in almonds. I think it was less of a bad year in pistachios. So I don't have any traps, so I can't tell you what pressures look like this year, but hopefully people learned after last year.
Okay. The beetle you were telling about earlier, it was affecting mostly Madera County or Merced County?
I think so. Houston Wilson, our entomology specialist with UC Riverside, would be a better person to ask.
Okay.
He did a survey, and I think he was finding it in other areas as well. I know that some folks were reporting it in Madera County, but I would ask him.
Any other things you want to add on to our conversation right till now?
Let's see. I think we covered the big ones. Cutting off nitrogen, cutting off water,
Plant bugs,
and then the early splits in pistachios. Yeah, I think that's a good overview, at least of
this
the
to do.
entomological.
For this month, what we be expecting.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you, Phoebe.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. So ਇਸ ਹਨ Phoebe Gordon, UCANR Madera ਤੇ ਮਰਸੈਡ ਕਾਉਂਟੀ ਤੋਂ, ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੇ ਆਪਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਅੱਜ ਐਲਮੰਡਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਨਾਈਟ੍ਰੋਜਨ ਨੂੰ ਕੱਟ ਆਫ ਕਰਨ ਦੇ ਲਈ ਜਾਂ ਕੱਟ ਬੈਕ ਕਰਨ ਦੇ ਲਈ, ਇਰੀਗੇਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵਾਟਰ ਮੈਨੇਜਮੈਂਟ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਉਹ ਗੱਲ ਕੀਤੀ, ਪਿਸਟੈਸ਼ੀਓਜ਼ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਪਲਾਂਟ ਬਗਸ ਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਉਹ ਆਪਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਜਾਣਕਾਰੀ ਦਿੱਤੀ, ਤੇ ਨਾਲ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਇੱਕ ਬੀਟਲ ਇਸ ਟਾਈਮ ਕਹਿ ਲਓ ਵੀ ਇੱਦਾਂ ਦਾ ਪਹੁੰਚਿਆ ਹੋਇਆ ਵੀ ਜਿਸ ਨੂੰ ਨਸ਼ਟ ਕਰਨਾ ਬਹੁਤ ਔਖਾ ਹੈ, ਉਸ ਬਾਰੇ ਵੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਥੋੜ੍ਹਾ ਬਹੁਤਾ ਆਪਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਜਾਣਕਾਰੀਆਂ ਦਿੱਤੀਆਂ ਆ। ਸੋ ਹੋਪਫੁਲੀ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਜਾਣਕਾਰੀਆਂ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਕੁਛ ਗੇਨ ਕਰਕੇ ਆਪਣੇ ਔਰਚਰਡਸ ਨੂੰ, ਆਪਣੀ ਕ੍ਰੌਪ ਨੂੰ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਬਚਾ ਕੇ ਰੱਖੋ ਅਤੇ ਉਸ ਨੂੰ ਬੈਟਰ ਕਰ ਸਕੋ। ਅੱਜ ਦੀ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਇੱਥੇ ਹੀ ਸਮਾਪਤ ਹੈ। ਅਪਡੇਟ ਫਾਰਮਿੰਗ ਨੂੰ ਸਮਾਪਤ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ। ਮਿਲਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਅਗਲੀ ਵਾਰੀ। ਸਭ ਨੂੰ ਪਿਆਰ ਭਰੀ ਸਤਿ ਸ਼੍ਰੀ ਅਕਾਲ। ਥੈਂਕ ਯੂ।